forgot my glasses, so I'm wearing a nice pair of lady glasses, courtesy of my friend Joan Gableman. So, and it's being recorded for posterity, which is even worse. At least they don't have any bling on them. For my last talk, those of you who came, there'll be some repetitive stuff today because I'm kind of talking about the same thing, the people side of mining, which I think is probably the most interesting part. No PowerPoint, I'm just going to blab today. If you get bored, feel free to doze off or go somewhere else. I won't be hurt. So if everybody leaves, I can leave early. Mining can be a tough subject to talk about unless you're talking to other professionals. Its importance and understanding it by the average person is a real challenge. Would you sit down, ma'am? Like a lot of things, people have preconceived ideas ranging from good to horrible, but it's about something that's totally foreign to almost everybody who hasn't been there. Working underground is like being dropped on another planet. There have been books and articles written about mining that focused on people, but very few of them have been written by people who've actually done it. It's easy to romanticize the profession, for better or for worse. You always hear about the horrible life of miners and how bad it was, and that's true, but in the times that we're talking about here in Butte, believe me, there were a lot worse things. Hi, Don, Steve, Larry. You didn't miss anything yet.
Doesn't like me to sing about it.
I'm going to try and be descriptive enough to give you a glimpse into the human side of underground mining and why miners fall in love with mining. The romance of mining, as a famous author, T.A. Rickert, called it back in the 1890s. And he traveled all over the West studying mines, very famous mining engineer, but he lived it, he understood it. Even if you ain't from around here, if you've lived in Butte for very long, you probably know more about mining than the average American. At the same time, there are a lot of people here whose parents and grandparents and even great-grandparents mined here and have never been underground. They've heard their family members talk about it, describe it. It's been a subject that's beaten a lot of them literally to death as far as conversation goes, but they don't actually know. There's a lot of people here who don't notice at all, but mining still surrounds us here. It's a constant theme in news, government affairs, and the economy, not to mention the landscape. In this room, I'm sure there's folks at both ends of the love-hate spectrum, but we all depend on mining for our physical possessions and well-being. You may never have thought about it, but the progress of our civilization is measured by the products of mining. If it isn't grown, it has to be mined. The ages of stone, copper, bronze, steel, and now silicon are benchmarks of our ever-increasing comfort and our wealth is based in precious metals and gems. Our cities on ordinary crushed gravel, which most people don't think about as mining, and pavement for concrete and pavement, as well as steel beams, copper wires, all the things that tie us together. Mining in Butte, as Floyd pointed out Tuesday, was world-class big. About a square mile of Silverbowl County supplied a third of the copper for the United States and a quarter for the entire world during almost 40 years, and remained a major source for another 70. Especially during the war years, World War I, World War II, completely separate mines in Butte were also the biggest producers of zinc and manganese in the United States. Butte and Anaconda, back in the day, were the frontier of mining technology from the 1880s almost to the end of the Anaconda Company nearly 100 years later. complex ores, many of which have never been seen before, the depth and size of the ore bodies, the heat of the workings, initial distance from civilization, and the legal complications of diverse ownership all forced practical solutions that had worldwide effects and benefits. The Anaconda Company was the largest vertically integrated mining company in the world. They mined it, they processed it, they smelted it, they produced copper products from it. It was almost an unknown concept at the time, and yet there is no more Anaconda Company. The ore body continues to be mined by Montana Resources today as one of the major American molybdenum and copper mines. There is estimated to be 4 times more theoretical ore left underground than has ever been mined. Given good worldwide economic conditions, MRI has some 40 years of ore left to be mined by open pit. You probably never thought about it, but MRI mines over 1 million tons of rock every week. That's a lot of rock. My own experience, well, I should say, in spite of our severe climate and relative isolation, MRI is one of the lowest cost producers in the world, in the lowest 10% of cost. Most of that credit rests on the work ethic and the skills of the people who work there. It's a real testimony to Butte and its people. I spent several years of my childhood on a mountain ranch with no electricity or running water. In the winter, we walked over 1 mile each way down to the county road, packed groceries home at night to a cold, uninsulated house where we waited in our coats and mittens for the wood stove to drive the cold back outside. Grudgingly, I brought buckets of water from the well and made nighttime trips to the outhouse. It was a daily routine. An unusual childhood that seemed perfectly normal at the time, no different than most of our neighbors. Those experiences make it easy for me not to only look back at the early times, but to feel the conditions those people lived in, worked under, and be able to understand much more of their world than the average person today. Although only a couple of 100 miles of physical distance away, small mining in central Montana was about as far as from Butte mining as you could get. The deepest mines were only about 600 feet deep and comfortably cool. There were no big companies, no union activism to fight them. There are no real environmental issues today. The heyday of gold mining in central Montana lasted about 22 years, from 1886 to 1918, with some resurgence after the price of gold went up until 1934, until the government closed down all the gold mines in 1942. For a couple of years after 1900, Fergus County was the leading gold producer in Montana. The ore was 2 distinct types. One was very large, low-grade ore bodies, easily treated with simple cyanide mills, but the other one, the one I got into, was very high-grade gold that could be won by simple gravity and mercury amalgamation, or shipped directly to the smelter, either in East Helena or in Anaconda. And this was the stuff dreams are made of. It has drawn treasure hunters since the daybreak of history. Many of you have heard the story how I got into mining. When I was a kid, I had hay fever very bad. And neighbors had a little underground mine, and I found out there wasn't any pollen underground. So after that, I just about lived underground. I really liked not having hay fever, but I truly fell in love with mining. Talk about the romance of mining. The big, noisy machinery fascinated me, especially what amounted to the largest train set kid ever had. Lots and lots of underground track winding through pitch black, mysterious labyrinths, sometimes opening up into huge caverns, and sometimes letting the kid crawl through little crawly holes, not knowing what was going to come up. Oh yeah, and explosives. Lots of dynamite and seeing the pure power of using it to make an opening in solid rock. The addictive thrill of finding a high-grade pocket of ore, seeing gold in the rock. Sometimes that vein was only a couple of inches wide, but so rich that it was worth digging out by hand and putting in canvas sacks so you didn't even lose the dust. There was so much going on, so many wonderful toys in a fantasy world, treasure to be found, but the people faded into the background at that age. The trees in the forest, so to speak, invisible to the traveler focused on the trail. I didn't really realize until years later that I fell in love with the people. They were all the same kind of characters. Their stories were different, but with the same themes. All the tales soaked in, and once I grew up past the gambling stage, looking for treasure, the ore and the machinery faded into the background. My focus has become the generations of people who made the mines and what they had to put into that life. I've got a lot of romantic memories of being in the mines as a kid, and I'm sure I was a complete pest. Underfoot at the most inconvenient times, thoroughly trying the patience of men who worked in a rhythm where every move counted. They didn't see anything wrong with a little kid underground, but they made sure I learned the rules and didn't forget them. Inattention or disobedience were immediately stopped. Bang. Usually using methods that would have appalled Dr. Spock. Things were different when they were kids or even raising their own. Until maybe after World War II, you listened, obeyed, and produced, or else you might end up starving or dead. When you're old enough to work, you worked. That was one of the reasons for larger families in those days. On the short term, there were many, many times that I ended up crying my eyes out in the dark, alone in some remote part of the mine, wondering how my mom could have left me with these horrible people. Oh wait, she didn't. I was the one that asked to be there. But I never walked away, and in the end I came to appreciate the reasons for their unapologetic discipline and their honesty in doing it. There was a fairly large fraternity of prospectors and small miners in those days all over Montana. Many of them old men still looking for the big bonanza. Most of them were born in the 19th century and started working in the days well before power equipment. They actually worked from the days of candles and hand drilling right up through electric cap lamps and jackleg drills. When they were young, there were very few of our modern conveniences. Almost all of them saw electricity, telephones, all the things that we took for granted come into the country. They had traveled by stagecoach and hauled heavy loads in wagons pulled by horses, mules, and even oxen. Work wasn't a four-letter word in those days. It was just what it took to make a living. There was seldom any difference between Friday and Monday. Sunday was the only special day. With a few notable exceptions, as there are in any profession or community, these were men and women who commanded instant respect. When you met them, you knew this was a person of substance. 3 generations before mine who had grown up without the modern comforts. They lived through world wars and the Depression by working hard and helping each other, doing whatever it took to hang on while they raised their kids. Work ethic, as we think of it today, is a pretty hollow echo of what it was for those folks. Welfare wasn't. It was personal effort to help your neighbors, and it worked. These were the last of the old miners and their story of the good old days. Starting in the Little Rocky Mountains of eastern central Montana and continuing west there were hundreds of Montanans who at least tried to make a living from their own mine or else were hooked on the dream. Some actually make money at it now and again, but more than a few worked in Butte during the winter to make a few dollars and also to restock on supplies through the tacit generosity of the Anaconda Company. Most everybody took their lunch underground and brought their bucket back up, filled full of bits and explosives. Like the average Butte miner, these weren't men looking for wages, lived here. They were gamblers who believed that the bonanza was just one more round ahead. They were just a foot from $1 million. The vast majority were more like 1,000,000 feet from a dollar. There were a lot of Butte miners who worked in the mines and went out in the hills around here and had a prospect or an actual mine somewhere that they kept pretty well supplied, just like everybody else did with the generosity of the Anaconda Company. They spent much of their lives and a big chunk of their income on chance. True gamblers. But if they were alive today, they wouldn't even look at a casino. That's small potatoes. Pretty boring. Mining wasn't a job. It isn't a job. It was a passion. Like the Indians, the Native Americans, or the people reciting their heritage, they told and retold the old stories about high-grade discoveries and the men who just missed them just that much. Lost mines, fallen off veins. It was easy for them to justify their optimism by recounting how the old-timers didn't have this modern piece of equipment or know how that process worked to recover it, and how they could have just easily have missed it. That's IT in capital letters. However, in most cases, it turned out the old-timers weren't so dumb after all. There have been a lot of cases where somebody worked and worked and worked, sometimes for years, to get to a supposed target, a vein that was missed underground, and get there only to find a hole. The Brotherhood of Dreamers wasn't limited to Montana, it was everywhere there was mining. It was what brought people west in the 1800s from the gold rush of 1849 on. If you go back to that day and look at the lives of the ordinary people, especially back east, there wasn't a whole lot of excitement, you might say, or opportunity to make more than limited wages. You might be able to go to work in a textile mill. You might be able to go to work in an iron foundry or an iron plant. But you imagine day after day of being in, say, a steel mill, an iron mill or a steel mill, and all you're doing is wages. You aren't going to find any sudden bonus. You're just working for straight wages. The farmers and ranchers, it was the same thing. They were completely at the mercy of the weather, Mother Nature. Sometimes they'd work their butts off and get hailed out, dried out, just bad markets. A lot of things could happen. So when you keep mining in mind, compared to those professions, it wasn't all that bad. Every successful mine started with a discovery made by one of these dreamers. But very few of them were happier after hitting the big bonanza, selling out to somebody. Most of them took whatever money they made, spent it however they thought they needed to, a lot of times on drink and less than good women, and went back to prospecting. Butte provides a lot of classical examples. When you stop to think of it, none of the Copper Kings discovered any ore. None of them. Their talent was in recognizing the discovery made by others and having the ability and resources to develop them. They were the ones that went on to fame and fortune, not the James Farlands and the Michael Hickeys who discovered the veins. Yeah, very few people know what happened to any of these early men whose names we know because of the Butte books, but they just faded away. Likewise, most of the stories of the men and women who worked in the mines to provide the wealth are lost, like single leaves in a hurricane. We know the names of some of them thanks to the Granite Mountain Memorial and the stories written about the speculator disaster, who gave everything for their lives, but you know they Moore and Manasdugan, but nobody remembers the names of any of the men they saved. Most people don't even know the names of their wives. Just a little tiny dot in history. Into the 50s and early 60s, when I was in school, the neighbors still farmed and logged with horses and mules, many of which they were close to as any human friend. This was a closing window on the past. Good thing I numbered these. When your livelihood and even life depended on good animals and the best possible relationship with them. On Facebook, you see threads every now and then of people just horrified by the life of the horses and mules underground, especially in Butte. I don't think so. If you've ever been around horses and mules, even in a barn, you know that the last thing you want to do is mistreat that animal and have them get mad at you. Well, when they're underground in a mine tunnel, it's a lot more confined, and they've got a lot more opportunity to take whatever frustrations they might have out on you. The mules were very, very well treated. The horses were very, very well treated. They had the best feed, clean water, good conditions, because everything in the mine, the production of the mine, depended on them as much or more than the miners themselves. When I was a kid, we had neighbors who had 2 mules that they logged with. And those mules were as smart as the operators, I think, because up to a mile away from the sawmill, they could be hooked up to a log, slapped on the butt, and by themselves they would take the log to the sawmill, wait to be unhooked, have the harness thrown back over their backs, and find their way back up to where they started from. The mines, mules, horses were the same. Once they learned their territory, they knew just where to go, they knew just what to do, they knew just how much of a load they were supposed to carry, and they knew who their favorite people were. And their favorite people took care of them. It's really a great story. A lot more needs to be written and recalled. Working with humans was no different underground, or with men, or on the surface with wives and kids. The bond of understanding and trust was the same. Underground, everything depends on your trust and the help of your partner. On the surface, the wives and even the kids had this common thread, wondering deep down somewhere whether the old man was coming home or not that night. And this was also true when you go out into farms and ranches to a certain extent, but there the risks were a lot less. They were out in the open country, but in mines, you're back in a remote area. There's not that many people to help you, and so your partner becomes everything. And on the surface, wives bonded together. They understood what each and the other was going through. Another Facebook theme, of course, is what a horrible life mining was, and on the surface, to the average person, it was. Yeah, there's no doubt. It was hot, it was dusty, miners tended to have a short life because of silicosis. You were thousands of feet underground. It goes on and on and on. But if you put yourself in the life of some homesteader in eastern Montana just comes out, stakes out 40 acres to be his own, and then he has to dig a well to find water. He has to be close enough to civilization to get some supplies. He goes out, he's pulling a plow at best with a horse, and maybe he's doing it himself just to get enough basic ground broken to grow food on. Hot sun blazing down, snows of winter, whatever comes along for weather. There was no picnic there either. And as I said, mining versus working back east in any of the industries there, those people were day labor. They were dispensable. There was always somebody waiting to take a job if you didn't like what you were doing for what you were being paid. I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, when you talk about, and as on the front of the building here, the immigrants that came to Butte, and we kind of tend to focus on the Irish, but myself, I like to kind of think about the Finlanders that were here. If you read the history of Finland, that was a country that was never really a country until really modern times. Finland was under the control of the Russians or the Swedes or the Norwegians or even the Germans who happened to come along, and their life could turn topsy-turvy overnight depending on who was in control. Much of their life was like Ireland, except they had really nasty winters up there. In Ireland, of course, you had the famine, and long before that you had Cromwell's horror, where Irish people were shipped to Jamaica as slaves. And when they first came to Butte with a limited mining knowledge, mining wasn't a big industry in Ireland. A lot of them ended up working for the English in the coal mines, but they had some mining experience, so at least they knew they weren't afraid of the underground. And when they came here, when their relatives came here and said, oh, hey, this conditions are tough here too, but it's nothing like home. We eat regular, we work 8 or 10 hours, we get paid. And they'd send money back home to these people that were living this existence that was so far below what we can even imagine, that they'd do anything they could to come here. In the old underground photographs that you see, these guys are kind of frozen in time, and you stop and think about it, these pictures were taken in total, absolute blackness. There's nothing like the blackness underground. And after that photographer's flash powder goes off, everybody's in real blackness because they're blinded by the flash powder. And it's black anyway. You see these pictures where there's miners and there's a candlestick stuck in this rib and there's a candlestick stuck in this piece of timber. And that's all there is. There's two basically big lighters lighting the whole area. When you talk about the injuries, the deaths in Butte, well, in Butte, there were 10,000 miners working underground in 1917. All of those guys were working at best by carbide lamp, but still the candle was pretty prevalent in those days. It's no wonder you had so many injuries and deaths. And I like to point out, and I did the last time I talked, that a lot of these guys were nearsighted. They couldn't see if they were out in the broad daylight, so imagine what it was like for them underground. You're in a working place where the rocks above you are as high as this ceiling, and you can't even see them. Is there a loose rock up there? Is there one ready to come down? What's happening up there? I don't know. Can't see past the glow of the candle. Pretty tough life. Montana Resources, getting back to modern times, is just coming up on 6 years without a lost time accident. I think that's 4.3 or 4.4 million man-hours of working. And you think back to 1917, that was about between 20 and 30 million man-hours a year underground in Butte. And that doesn't include just the 10,000 men underground. when we're talking about Montana Resources, that's their total employee. Everybody from the secretary in the office to the guy out in the pit. Well, if you put that kind of number on the Anaconda Company, just in Montana at one time, the Anaconda Company employed 27,000 people, plus all the people that worked in the industries that supported them, the machine shops and the logging outside of their own operations. So the people side of it, people are what really make mining, and for most of us today, it's pretty easy to just look at the head frames and the waste dumps and the Superfund site and say, well, yeah, I understand mining, but if you put yourself in the shoes of the people that were there at the time and the conditions that they lived under, it kind of gives you a whole new perspective on life. This Saturday at the World Museum of Mining is Miners Union Day. It's our chance to get the people to come up, show them some exhibits. And when you look at those exhibits, don't just look at the item. Think about the people that worked with them, or lived in those cabins, worked in those stores, and the times that they lived in. And I've got to take off early to be up there, so I'm going to say, are there any questions?
Are you going to write a book, Larry?
Oh, I've got all kinds of things that I've written and just kind of set aside. And, you know, someday when I'm dead and gone, somebody will say, oh, look at this, let's put it together in a book.
Oh, come on, you're just passing the buck. You should do that. Put it together yourself.
Yeah. I work on it, you know, I keep saying, well, I'll do it when I'm old sometimes, so. In the winter when there's nothing better to do. My wife's laughing hysterically up here.
Mention these CDs over here are free. Nancy Foote brought these in.
What are they?
It's the Butte, my Butte. Richest Hill on Earth, that's what it is. It's the
Ooh.
Butte Richest Hill on Earth.
Richest Hill on Earth.
Nancy
3D
Thomas
DVD.
brought them in and said that those are free.
Wow,
Yeah.
such a deal.
So
Did you get one?
Not yet. Bring it up. There's a question.
Question.
I have a question, and I have to sort of set a premise which maybe you will not agree with to begin with. But
I disagree with that completely.
I understand that, you know, immigrants would come over and there'd be a better life through mining, and in the last century there was increased prosperity with every generation, and at one point, you know, every father and mother hoped their son would become a miner. But then it seems to me, and in modern society, it's not an esteemed profession, and you would hope that instead your child would go to college or something. What decade do you think that started to change, when it was a job that the better half had, and then it became a job that the lower half had?
Oh, I wouldn't agree with the lower half. I wouldn't agree with that.
Okay.
The average miner at Stillwater makes over $100,000 a year. Now, if you think that's lower class, I'd have to disagree with
Well,
that.
no, I don't. I guess I'm thinking of like the dangerous conditions and the unhealthful environments.
And we've got the government to look after us now. We have a world of safety regulations now. But to answer your basic question, I'll tell you what the change was, and the simple answer is mechanization. Back in the 1800s, all mining was done by hand, and it was caught up in the Industrial Revolution, where we went from, say, the 1830s, where most people produced what they needed or could get it from their neighbors. Once the Industrial Revolution started, a lot of people went to work for businesses, whether it was steel mills or cotton gins or whatever it was. They didn't have time or enough neighbors to grow their own needs. They moved into cities. All of a sudden you developed a producer segment of society you've never had before. Well, when you get into the steel and iron age, say after the Civil War, there was a horrible demand for iron, steel, zinc, metal products that were mined, even sand and gravel, and it was all hand labor. If you look at these historic pictures of the big stamp mills in Butte, the Alice stamp mill, the Lexington stamp mill, the Burlington stamp mill, they talk about 120 stamp mill. Huge, huge building, big complexes. Each stamp only crushed 1.5 tons of ore a day. So you've got 200 or 300 miners that are producing 150 tons a day. In the late, well, say from 1890 on, all of a sudden a lot of inventions came into play where mechanization allowed a miner to get away from having to drill every inch of hole with by hand. Black powder got supplanted by dynamite. It took fewer and fewer miners to produce the same amount of rock, and the demand for the rock was increasing all the time. So by World War II, just to use an example of date, mining was largely mechanized. Many of the present modern machinery that we use had been invented and was in use. So the number of miners dropped off. In the 1880s, almost everybody knew somebody that was involved in mining some way or another, just like they knew somebody that was a farmer or a rancher. Your neighbor was one of the above. Now, the farmers are actually in the same business we are. They've mechanized themselves to the stage where very, very, very few people supply all of the needs of civilization.
Can I add a little bit to what you're saying?
Sure.
I think it had to do a lot also with the change of when you went from underground mining to the pit mining. You went from very highly skilled, those miners were considered a skilled labor force, to a labor force that wasn't quite as skilled.
That's
The
insulting to those drivers.
Well,
They're
this
very
is
specifically trained.
this is something that I've read that it's documented in here, and that was one of the changes that they saw, is that the set of skills changed. So which affected so many things here. The power held by the mining union decreased as the other unions came up, because you had people who, the miner who would go underground had to know carpentry and be an electrician as well as mining. There were so many things, different skill sets he had to have. Whereas when they switched to the pit mining, they were more divided. This guy worked as, for the electricians union. He's an electrician. This guy's a plumber. He's going to do all the plumbing work. This guy's going to drive the trucks. So it was a different sort of skill set that was required when they changed from the underground mining to the pit mining. And then, of course, with the mechanization, like you said, it took fewer people to extract larger amounts of ore from the ground.
And when you stop and think about Montana Resources producing 1 million tons a week, if you took Butte at its heyday, you're talking about it takes 6 months or more to produce that kind of tonnage from underground. So the whole population focus changed, and that's where you see mining, farming, several other professions reduced down to where they're almost silent in the background.
Well, and post-World War II, I think it kind of extends to most areas of life, that generation of people, because that's when I grew up, was in the 50s, that generation of people, they all wanted their kids to attend college and become professionals. And that just spanned, it wasn't just in mining communities, it was everywhere.
I would say the GI Bill.
Yeah, the GI Bill.
The GI Bill.
To go into college, and I think they started turning out more of a, professional class, and the blue collar stuff was maybe looked down on more. So I understand what you're saying. But why did that result in? We outsourced everything, and now we don't have any industry left in this country to support ourselves. So I think it was post-World War II, I think the 50s and 60s was when that really
I think so.
John?
In just your working years, is there anything that, compared to when you started to compared to today, the question is, out of the ore they're getting today, is there anything they're not getting out of the ore? I mean, in the sense that they're getting, with the technology, I would think the only thing left is the power bill.
No, they use a lot of iron. A lot of iron gets steel, especially steels get ground up in the production of ore. There are a lot of costs that go into it that probably have, well, certainly has changed because of open pit mining. But underground, it's pretty much the same, except for the advent of rubber-tired equipment and hydraulic drills.
Yeah, but when it goes to the concentrator, I guess I should have said that in the beginning. If you got a ton of raw ore from, just say, the East Ridge, are they getting the gold, the silver, the lead, the molybdenum, the tin, the this, the that, the diamonds? I mean, I don't care what you call them.
Yeah.
Are they getting everything out of it?
They're getting as much as they can. The last time that I looked, the average ore coming out of the Continental East Pit contained 0.18% copper, which is 3.6 pounds of copper in every ton of rock, and 0.036 pounds of molybdenum, which is less than a pound of moly per ton of rock. And then in the concentrator, they get around 86% of that. That sound about right, Don?
What's
And
the rest of it?
the rest of it?
Yeah, what is the rest of it?
The rest of it is rock, basically rock.
Right.
And then there's zinc, there's, there's a little bit of lead, there's a little bit of this, there's a little bit of that, but it's not economically
It's not
recoverable.
worth, yeah.
Because the smelters are very specialized. Back in the day when the Anaconda Company was running, when the smelter in Anaconda was in full blast, most people don't know what all went on there. There was not only the copper smelter, there was a zinc plant, there was a lead plant, there was of all things, fertilizer plant. They used their sulfuric acid that came out of the byproduct from the stack smoke to combine with the phosphate in the area and make phosphate fertilizer.
I'm going to switch gears on you. So, assumption and a two-part question. One, you grew up in Lewistown, and were you mining gold, and then you started a company when you were 14. Were you sinking your own drift, doing your own mining? So
I started my own company because there was an old guy that I worked with that wanted to drive a tunnel, and he didn't want to do it himself, and he didn't want me just being there. So he said, well, why don't you form a little company and you can drive this tunnel for me.
it was gold?
Oh, yeah.
What mine was it?
That was a little mine that doesn't even hardly exist anymore up there. There were a lot of little mines and all over Montana. There were little gulches here, there, and everywhere. Every gulch had a miner.
This continental pit, I assume it's getting bigger. Which direction is it going? Are they taking the ore from?
Basically, it's going northeast.
Northeast?
Right.
Is it going to eventually be hindered by the expressway there?
Oh, eventually it probably will be. Yeah. In open pit mining, you're pretty well, you can kind of describe it as a 45-degree angle. Even if you've got real high-grade ore in the middle down here, you still have to mine all of this stuff up here to keep that angle fairly shallow so it doesn't cave in on you.
So is it getting deeper as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going down. Less tons are being produced from going down than expanding. And that's where the stripping ratio comes in for every ton of ore that they're mining. I think right now they're mining between 2 and 3 tons of waste. And one of the sad parts about the whole thing is government regulations, many of which are good, but in this case, when MRI started up, the desire was to take their mill tailings and their waste rock and backfill the Berkeley pit. And the EPA wouldn't give them, MRI was willing to accept their part of the responsibility for anything they did. But what they didn't want to take a bite of was the back part, the circling, the comprehensive recovery of all past damages. So it never came to be, but if you stop and think about it, where would Butte be now if they had actually done that? The inflow of water into the Berkeley pit would probably be less than a third of what it is now, because you fill the hole with rock and clay and agglomerating materials, and you've backfilled it with rock. You'd have this little bitty pond that you just need to accumulate the water to put through the treatment plant. You wouldn't have people worried about, oh, it's going to slop over and deluge Butte. What happens when this reaches a certain thing? We've got these billions and billions of gallons of water that are going to seep into our aquifer. It'd be a small pond you control.
And so why isn't that allowed to happen?
It wasn't allowed to happen because the EPA wouldn't give Montana Resources a buy on the past damage, on taking a bite out of the total Superfund site.
In other words, when you take over a certain area, you take over everything.
Right.
That is, ARCO assumed the responsibility of what had happened under ACM, and MRI said, no, we don't want to take all of their
They took their
mistakes
responsibility
for
their
what they
mine
did, but we don't
plan,
want to,
But they didn't want to go clear back and take a bite out of the total
for the
Superfund,
past 100
which they had
years.
nothing to do with.
So you're the first person that I've ever heard say that the Berkeley pit could safely be filled back in.
It'd be hard to do now.
Could have been.
It would be impossible to do now because you'd be displacing.
Oh, you mean they had to do that before all
They
the water?
could,
And they started
yeah.
in 1986.
I
The
see.
water level in the Berkeley pit was only a few
Right,
hundred feet.
I see,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Because the pumps got shut off in 82,
Yeah.
so that's.
So they'd have to lower it as much as they could now. And,
They'd have to do massive pumping.
And-
Because when
and
you
then
talk
do it.
about dumping 1 million tons of rock a week into the Berkeley pit, then you're talking about this major landslide that everybody's worried about, only man-made.
Yeah.
oh, interesting.
Steve, it's your turn.
What was the quality of the water that they were pumping out of the mine before they, shut off the pumps at the Kelly?
It was very acidic water, and it contained, I'm trying to think, do you know how much water it contained, how much copper it contained, Don? I'm thinking it was around 4 pounds per
Something on that order, but
ton
I
of
don't
water.
remember, it escaped me.
But it got pumped up northeast of Walkerville, and then it ran down. They actually pumped it over some of they call it leach ore, the ore from the pit that was too low grade to process in the concentrator, but still had copper in it. This acidic water would percolate through that, pick up a few more pounds of copper, and then they run it through the precipitation plant where they add iron in the form of mostly tin cans, detinned cans, and the copper would precipitate on the iron, and they'd recover that copper. And then, unfortunately, that iron-laden water went into Silver Bow Creek. Nowadays, that same process is still going on. They're pumping water from the Berkeley pit into the precipitation plant, and then that water goes to the water treatment plant, where the pH is brought up, and all the a lot of the metals are precipitated out, and then it goes back into the Berkeley pit. And this is gradually changing. The pH in the Berkeley pit is gradually coming up. But like I say, there's billions of gallons of water there, and we're only putting in a few thousand a day of treated water.
So where does the water that goes through Silver Bow Creek come from then? Where is it?
Actually, there's almost no water that goes into Silver Bow Creek from the traditional Yankee Doodle Gulch.
Okay.
It all comes in from Blacktail Creek,
Oh,
from that south range.
Upstream by, they put a certain amount of water in it from the Silver Lake line just to keep it flowing, I think.
Yeah, but it's pretty, there's not much to see between the, say, Texas Street Bridge and down by the Chamber of Commerce. Anybody else? Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you.